Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, never a borrower or a lender be, apparently. Shock deepens across the continent's financial sectors over the recent credit rate slash of Afreximbank. Many see it as unfair, as the Africa-owned institution has a pretty strong track record. The AU accuses ratings agency Fitch of getting it wrong. Also, Kenyan medical examiners say that it's very unlikely that a teacher who died in police custody died of suicide. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, there are more calls on the street for accountability over Albert Ojwang's death. And dozens of countries in France for a crucial ocean treaty call for an agreement to cut back on plastic production. Another one of the key issues being thrashed over is overfishing. We head to South Africa, where communities are trying to change the way that they look after the iconic kelp forests upon which their livelihoods rely. But first, the African Union's accused ratings agency Fitch of unfairly jumping the gun by downgrading the African Export-Import Bank's credit rating to BBB. Now, that's just a notch above junk status, sending all the wrong signals about investing in Africa. Afreximbank was set up to give the continent's nations more options and control when borrowing money for projects, and it plays an important role in plans to boost intra-African trade. But with several member states like South Sudan, Zambia and Ghana failing or dragging their feet over paying back their sovereign loans or the terms originally set to do so, Fitch last week judged that the risks facing Afreximbank's operations are worryingly substantial. To break all down what this means for the continent, I'm joined now by analyst Mr. Bright Simmons, who joins us from Accra. Bright, thanks so much for making the time to speak to me. Now, first of all, why does the African Union think that Fitch was unfair and got it wrong by downgrading Afreximbank?
Georgia, it's pretty straightforward. The African Union feels that because these are governments that have signed a treaty to more or less create the Afreximbank, they have a commitment to pay back eventually. The challenge, obviously, is that these specific governments and the specific loans that they've received are indeed in default. The African Union makes a much more grander geopolitical point about the fact that, normal commercial credit standards shouldn't apply because this is primarily a political situation.
So with the majority of our viewers perhaps not being as well versed in the ins and outs of finance as you probably are, break it down for us. Why has there been such horror across the financial sectors in Africa over this move by Fitch? And also, what are the wider repercussions?
So the whole situation feeds into this concern around the cost of capital and whether Africa is unfairly charged too much to borrow. So if Africa is charged too much to borrow and therefore pays too much on its debt, typically that makes it very difficult to service the debt, and it leads to defaults, which then makes it more difficult for Africa to borrow. So it's called the Africa premium. And this Africa premium is considered unfair. I'll give you an example. Even though Nigeria had about a 40% debt to GDP, at one point it was paying over 111% of all its revenue servicing the debt. And Japan will have more than 230% of debt to GDP, and it will spend not more than 10% servicing its debt. So that massive gap between how much Africa actually owes and how much of its income it spends on the debt is what has made people so horrified. The problem, of course, is that Fitch was only following the rules. Even though the African Union, of course, objects to the action was based on the fact that the loans were indeed 6 months overdue. In the case of South Sudan, Afreximbank had already gone to court in London to compel Sudan to pay back. That clearly is a loan in default. And so, I don't think that it's correct to say that Fitch acted wrongly or that it misclassified the loan, but you have to understand the broader geopolitical and developmental context that drives the African Union, which Africa is paying too much for the debt it has, and this is affecting its ability to develop.
So does it have any traction in this argument? Because, I mean, if basically they're saying the rules were never designed for the African context, and by having these rules applied to Africa's fortunes, it's further dragging it back in terms of its bid to try and develop. Does it have any hope of mitigating the impact of that credit downgrade at all?
No bones about that. There are no doubts that the African Union has serious policy concerns about the fact that we continue to have a situation where African countries are spending more on servicing their debt than they are spending on education and spending on health and the rest. But Fitch is an opinion giver. It simply advises investors whether it's safe to invest in a company like Afreximbank or an organization like Afreximbank. Fitch has a duty also to its investors. And from Fitch's point of view, if your non-performing loans exceed 6%, and what has happened in Ghana, Zambia, and South Sudan has indeed led to the non-performing loans of Afreximbank exceeding 6%, then its credit model requires it to downgrade because of the credit risk component, the contribution to credit risk.
But I'm not going to have you for much longer. I don't have you for much longer, but I want very quickly to know whether the upcoming vote at the end of this month, you think that for a new president for Afreximbank might be affected by what just happened? Might it affect the direction that board members might want to see the next president take the bank in? Very quickly.
Absolutely. The new president has to make a decision whether some of these somewhat riskier loans will continue, because that's what has driven the growth of Afreximbank from just $7 billion in assets to over $40 billion in assets. But there is a risk. If some of these loans go bad, the rating agencies will come hard on Afreximbank. So does Afreximbank become slightly more conservative like African Development Bank and other banks and slow down its growth? Or does it continue to drive this growth forward, which the African governments love because of the flexibility of these loans and the fact that Afreximbank can move faster and quicker and plug in gaps that some of the other multilateral development banks and development finance institutions are not willing to plug. So this is a strategic decision that the new president must make.
Bright Simmons, thank you so much for breaking that down for such a complex web of considerations and impacts for us so clearly. Well, Kenyan medical examiners say that it's very unlikely that a teacher who died in police custody killed himself. There were more calls for accountability and marches on Tuesday over 31-year-old Albert Ojwang's death. He was arrested in the west of the country last week after posting online accusations of corruption against Police Deputy Inspector General Eliud Kipkoech. Ojwang was then transferred more than 250 kilometers to Nairobi, where police claim that he died over the weekend after hitting his own head on a wall. Well, 5 pathologists who've examined his body say that the cause of death is very clear.
Head injury. We also have neck compression. And we also have other injuries spread all over the body that are pointing towards assault. And as I've just mentioned, we've taken specimens, and other investigative agencies are going to assist in getting other pieces of evidence which, pieced up together, will help in corroborating what we've just found.
Well, hundreds have joined a 9-bus land convoy travelling from Tunisia to Libya in a bid to reach Gaza. The UN's warned that Israel's blockade there has left the entire population facing famine. Demonstrators say that they're trying to break the siege on the Palestinian territory. Organisers say that they're not carrying aid but are trying to make a symbolic act. Travellers include doctors and other specialists and hope to arrive in southern Gaza by the end of the week, although Egypt has still not agreed that it can pass through its territories. Meanwhile, Cameroonian opposition leader Maurice Kamto's back home in his base in Yaoundé after almost 48 hours of house arrest in Douala. He'd had to cancel a meeting planned with his party after police surrounded CRM headquarters over the weekend. Our Ndia Eteng has more.
Cameroon's opposition candidate and contestant in the upcoming October 2025 presidential elections, Professor Maurice Kamto, has returned to his base in Yaoundé after he was subjected to several hours of house arrest in Douala on Sunday. Professor Maurice Kamto was prohibited from leaving his house and presiding over a meeting of his opposition Cameroon Renaissance Movement's political party. It should be noted that the presence of security forces was very obvious along the streets of the city of Douala prior to that meeting, which had been planned or which had been scheduled to take place on Sunday by 10 a.m. While supporters of the CRM party took to the streets of Douala, Professor Maurice Kamto, after waiting for several hours, took to his social media handles where he called on his supporters to return to their homes peacefully to avoid any form of confrontation with law enforcement officers. Police officers as well as gendarmerie officers barricaded roads and stopped people from moving in the direction towards the party headquarters in the Daido neighborhood in Douala. It should be noted that this is not the first time that a meeting of the opposition CRM party has been prohibited from holding by law enforcement officers, be it in Yaoundé or in Douala. Maurice Kamto just returned to Cameroon after successfully holding a rally with his supporters in Paris, France. He has returned to Yaoundé and has informed the public that he will be communicating about the party's activities in the days ahead. It should be noted that presidential elections in Cameroon are scheduled to hold in October 2025. A definite date or exact date has not been given. However, Professor Maurice Kamto as well as some opposition members have stated their intention to stand as presidential candidate. Meantime, the country's President Paul Biya is still to state if he would be a candidate in the October polls.
Indira Etting there for us. Now, more than 90 countries called for a global treaty to cut back on plastic production on Tuesday, amidst another round of hard-fought negotiations over protections for the world's vital oceans. Overfishing is also a concern. Now we head to South Africa, where communities on the coast are changing the way that they look after some of the iconic kelp forests upon which so many livelihoods rely. Our team reports.
At the crack of dawn, this sustainable kelp harvesting crew heads into the waters of Hunts Bay in the Western Cape. Kelp is in increasing demand for products used for agriculture, farming, and even cosmetics. But this area has been affected by poachers and overfishing in the past. So the industry has come together to follow sustainable practices that allow the kelp to keep growing.
But you have to make sure that you don't cut the stems. All we need is the leaves, because of it won't grow back again. So you're just destroying. Yeah, we're not here to destroy.
Giant kelp is the fastest growing plant in the world, expanding up to 50 centimetres per day. But for it to grow back and to protect the species dependent on it, harvesters must allow up to 2 years before returning to the same patch. The giant kelp is unique in South Africa, providing a home to over 1,000 species in what is known as the Great African Sea Forest.
It's dense in terms of the number of stems or stipes in between, but it creates a habitat within which fish can find themselves, swimming around there, accessing food, using the environment as a nursery area, as a feeding environment, as a shelter from, some of the larger predators like great white sharks and so on, which are surrounding the extent around the kelp forest. So it creates a structured, sheltered kind of environment.
This family from the Netherlands have come for a free diving experience to see the kelp.
I've seen people from all around the world. They've gotten to know the kelp forest through various documentaries, and people want to experience it for themselves to see how great it is.
They braved the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Great African Sea Forest is the only giant bamboo kelp forest in the world, stretching 1,000 kilometres from Cape Town to the Namibian border.
So cool. That is all we have time for Iron Africa. Thanks for watching, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
The ocean is facing unprecedented threats, from overfishing and pollution to rising sea levels and mounting scientific denial. The time to act is now. France and Costa Rica are uniting global leaders in Nice for a critical summit to defend our oceans and protect biodiversity. dozens of heads of state, one shared mission to turn the tide. From 9th to 13th June, follow every development of the 3rd United Nations Ocean Conference, a decisive moment for the planet. Live and in-depth coverage on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24 embraces digital. The best way to stay informed. Live blogs following international news in real time. The latest news in 5, 10 or 15 minutes. France 24, your first choice for news.